You come in here with a skull full of mush, and you leave thinking like a lawyer.
Yes, I found a flaw in the model that I perceive is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
If at any point, and I say if when I really mean when at every point, the profit maximizing motivation is at odds with the patient care help motivation, I don't see a world in which of their own volition they are going to choose patient care over maximizing profit.
Hi everyone, this is John Hanson from the Systemic Justice Project and the Flaw magazine at Harvard Law School. In this episode of Flaw School, hosts Molly Enlow and Gori Sood sit down with third-year law student Charlotte Lawrence to expose how private equity is infiltrating our healthcare system, and more specifically how profit-driven investors are playing shell games with nursing homes, trading care for cash flow, and leaving some of the most vulnerable residents in the wreckage. Charlotte unpacks the legal loopholes and financial sleight of hand that make it all possible, showing how the law isn't just failing to stop the harm, it's greasing the wheels. Welcome to Flaw School, the podcast about the flaws in the law.
Hey, welcome to Flaw School, a podcast that explores the flaws in our legal system. We're today's hosts, Molly Enlow and Gori Sood, and we are so excited to be hosting Flaw School's episode today. Every 2 weeks, we interview law students to uncover the role of corporate actors in producing many of our most urgent social problems, and the troubling tale of corporate actors shaping, bending, capturing, and breaking the law in their favor. In this episode, we'll be discussing private equity and healthcare. Today we're joined by Charlotte Lawrence, who is a California native. She has her research master's in history and philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge and a strong legal interest in international law and health law, specifically regulations of privately owned nursing homes. Thank you for being with us today, Charlotte.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I would love if we could start by sort of hearing a little bit about your journey here to law school.
Sure. As you'd mentioned, I had an interest in history and philosophy of science, and I was doing my own research in various topics, specifically relating to health ethics, organ donation ethics, and from that I was able to work in British politics for a member of parliament who is now in the Labour government, who is a brilliant mentor for me. And through that work, I was able to see how my interest in social ethics could be played out in a more legal realm. And that's why I wanted to come to law school. And it's been a really affirming journey for me so far.
So what has been kind of the best part of law school for you so far?
The best part of law school, it's a bit cliche, but it would have to be the people. When I got here, I didn't realize just how much of a learning curve going to law school would be. I think that I have never been around such generous, motivated, brilliant people who are willing to stay up all night to teach me something that they're going to be pitted against me to learn the very next day. And I think that I've made some incredibly genuine friendships here with people that are just my heroes. So it's the people, definitely.
That's so amazing. Yeah, I feel similarly. I would love to hear more about your plans for after law school. I know you have some things in the works.
At the moment, I'm going to be starting out working for a firm in litigation. I'm hoping to do international arbitration, do a little bit of public international work as well, and hopefully further explore some of the other legal interests that I have. I think one of the great things about Harvard is that they really encourage you to be a generalist and take on subjects in different areas of interest. So I've discovered an interest in bankruptcy and corporate restructuring, but also in health law and policy, as we're here to discuss. And so I'm hoping to keep exploring that as I start my more formal work at my firm.
That's super amazing to hear, and very affirming as an undergrad who has a million interests. But yeah, let's shift a little bit and talk about the topic today. So, how did you get interested in private equity and healthcare?
I've been interested in healthcare policy for a while. My boss, as I previously mentioned, the woman that I'd worked for before coming to law school, was a pharmacist before becoming a politician. And she has an interest in health policy, which I was able to explore alongside her. And I was working in the UK during the pandemic, where I was exposed to a lot of issues systemically with nursing home care, of course in a very different system in a different country. And when I came here, I have a friend who is in my year who I have really enjoyed discussing these issues with, who was working at the time in New York before I wrote this article that I'll be discussing with you, who heard about the lawsuit that was happening in New York that is pretty central to my article. And just discussing that lawsuit with him, learning more about it, was how I first got engaged with the facts. So I guess just talking around the water cooler with other law students.
Yeah, that is a great sort of segue into your article, which does center in part around this case happening with the New York Attorney General's office. Could you give us a brief overview of the circumstances of the case, where we are now?
I'd be happy to. So this case, I'll start out by saying that the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, has made it a focal point of her policy to make fraud, negligence, to go after that in the context of nursing homes. So it's been ongoing. This is one of many lawsuits that her office has put forth. This lawsuit in particular was with 4 nursing homes that Attorney General James, on behalf of the state of New York, was making it's Centers for Care LLC is a privately owned fund that owns 4 that we know of 4 nursing homes in the state of New York. And her petition was aiming to halt what was described in the claim as a pattern of repeated fraud, illegality in the operation of the nursing homes that was resulting in serious harm and even death to many of the residents. In terms of where, I think you asked about where the lawsuit is at right now, it's ongoing. The Attorney General's office is seeking restitution, different forms of relief, including injunctive relief, so basically having them halt the harmful behavior, and halting the profit motive-taking practices that the office is alleging is causing these harms.
So, you mentioned some of the broader typical legal loopholes that are insulated from public scrutiny. Could you briefly touch on how some of those work and what they are? And then I think also of interest might be some numbers and statistics of how the private equity form of ownership has sort of grown in this space.
Sure. And please stop me and ask me questions if I'm getting too into the jargon. I promise I'm relatively new to this as well. My background is very much in history and not in finance, but I will do my best. So the way that I understand it, and it is a private equity ownership and the loopholes that enable it to flourish in this industry. The ownership structure is, as I understand it, pretty complicated. And that's part of the issue, is it's very difficult to understand or to just kind of figure out, just as a regular person, who owns what, if it's owned ultimately by a private equity fund. But the way that this works in terms of legal loopholes is that funds take advantage of the fact that at the heart of their profit-making process, they do 2 things. They take on debt and they divert the money that they have to operating expenses pre-profit. Now, what all of this does is it creates an incentive for them to limit reinvestment into the nursing homes that they own, because they're trying to pay back the debt, cut costs, and extract as much value as possible to, as I said, pay back that debt interest and generate profits that they've promised to investors. So in terms of the loopholes, there's 4 main ones that I've outlined, and I'll go as quickly as possible, but please stop if you have any questions. The first loophole is a process called sale leasebacks, and this is, for me, a really difficult one because I don't see any regulation aimed currently at stopping this within this sphere, even though there has been ongoing policy pushes for maybe some of the other loopholes. The way that it works is that a private equity fund, will initially own the nursing home and the real estate in the buildings. And they'll sell the real estate to an investor, typically something called a real estate investment trust, or REIT. And if anyone who's listening chooses to Google this issue, you're going to see REIT everywhere. So after selling the property, the nursing home owner, the fund, will lease back the real estate. And the lease agreement will usually be for long term, like 10 to 20 years. And that will provide the investor with a stable, predictable income stream. And then that initial sale to the fund's investor, let's say they sell it for $10 million, the land, the building, injects immediate capital back into the nursing home business, which the firm can use for facility improvements. But that leads me to the second loophole, because I just call it fees, because it's easy for me to remember. If you have got a situation where you have $10 million and you have a state regulation saying that you can't profit for more than X amount, more than 10%. What you're going to do as a fund is you're going to own a cleaning service, you're going to own a nurse training program, you're going to own a catering service, and you are going to use that money, that capital, to pay all of those different actors that you own as the overarching fund. So you're technically reinvesting it into the nursing home, but you're paying for services that you own. So you are going to minimize the quality of those services and maximize the amount of money that you keep. But this is all pre-profit because you're maintaining that money before you see any profit. It's all technically being reinvested. So that's fees and sale leasebacks. That's 2. The third is called dividend recapitalization. Basically how this works is that a fund, and these are all legal loopholes, they're all allowed under current regulations. A private equity owned nursing home will take on a substantial loan, and this may and is often from an entity that the fund also owns, so from itself essentially. And once the loan is in place, the nursing home will use the loan to process a special dividend, quote unquote, paid back to them. And if you've heard the word dividend before, it's usually in the context of a company giving itself payments from its regular earnings. But a fund will give itself payments funded by the newly acquired debt. And so this is essentially a big chunk of money that they get to keep off of this, and it's essentially a benefit financially without having to improve prayer quality. And the last thing is roll-ups. And to me, this is the simplest thing to understand for me personally, which is where a fund will buy up a ton of different nursing homes in a geographic area so that there's no competition, raises prices, reduces incentive to enhance quality of care, and complements these other mechanisms quite nicely. So those are the 4 legal mechanisms.
Yeah. I mean, wow, they're doing the things.
Mm-hmm.
So now that we sort of have that background on the state of play, I know that this has become a bit of a hot button issue under the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm.
And he came out with a number of public statements and initiatives. I also know that Trump has touched on this in the past.
Yeah.
I'd love it if you could give us some insight on what the governmental response has been between those two different presidents?
Sure. And just to give you some context for that question, because I think that governments, have been trying to respond to this issue in one way or another for decades. But, and I outline this in my article, there are, I think, very different approaches that have been tried. And I think that has to do with misunderstandings of how this money is being allocated. There was a series of concerted studies published quite recently, I say quite recently, post-pandemic, that seem to outline the issues that I've been outlining for you and outline more extensively in my paper, about how transparency is one of the key facilitators for this type of harm. And so, admirably, the Biden administration has, in citing, for example, a paper from the Cornell School of Medicine, Public Health, has taken a page from that and has established through executive order minimum staffing standards, which are raised from what they had previously been set in, I believe, 1987, the last time it was set. Improving transparency, so homes are required to disclose ownership and management information, and various mechanisms to incentivize supporting family caregivers. So all of this will be phased in over the next 5 years. I will say this. This executive order was announced last spring. It's already, just a few weeks ago, faced some legal challenges. 20 Republican state attorney generals have filed a lawsuit against the Biden administration, arguing that these new staffing requirements could financially strain nursing homes, potentially leading to closures. So we'll see where those lawsuits head, especially in the wake of a new administration. So it's an interesting time to be having this discussion. President Trump has, as you had kind of alluded to, mentioned reforms that he would make in this space, which I definitely think are worth looking into. He announced a proposal to introduce, I don't know how serious this proposal was, but it was something he announced, to introduce a tax credit for family members caring for elderly relatives at home. I'm sure that there are many benefits to a tax credit for at-home caregivers in conjunction with other systemic changes. But I don't know if you guys can see some of the drawbacks. I certainly have an idea of what they might be.
Yeah, I think not this legislation or sort of regulatory scheme specifically, but I know that within Medicaid there's this idea that it is now, or it should be reimbursable, and now it is in Georgia. This is something that the legislators did maybe 2 sessions ago, but to have kinship care be reimbursable, so that people can help their relatives with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I think a lot of the pushback in that legislation was around sort of concerns of Medicaid fraud, this narrative that is largely unfounded and pretty costly to administer in terms of Medicaid fraud control units. So I know that on a state-based level, that's sort of what that looks like. But
I absolutely back that assessment. I think in addition to that, I see an avenue where a tax credit, while I'm sure well-intentioned and will have a positive impact, will be handled in a way that is unequal and inaccessible to many. It benefits only those who have taxable income. So you mentioned Medicaid. I can discuss the statistics for nursing home residents, but the majority of it, especially in private equity context, is being paid on Medicaid. And so, how much taxable income can a person have? It's a delayed financial benefit, that happens at a certain time of year. And it may create a disincentive for institutional reforms if you've got this kind of Band-Aid issue that some are benefiting from. So I worry if that is the only mechanism to relieve the institutional, as I see it, issues in private equity owned nursing homes and privately owned nursing homes in general.
Yeah, it's almost reminiscent of school vouchers.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Super interesting to think about how the administration transition will affect this issue. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the industry broadly. So I'm curious, what makes healthcare as an industry appealing to private equity groups?
Healthcare as an industry is appealing to private equity groups, if I can speculate. And this speculation might get a little ungenerous. So everyone should take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But I think one reason that I think it's a good target for private equity investment is that you have Medicaid, and the need is fairly steady. And in fact, when I say steady, the need has only increased substantially from, over the last century. It's increased a lot. I would have to find the statistic, but I know that the curve looks, for those of I'm making a sort of asymptotic motion with my hand. You've got a steady stream of funding. It's government funding. The need is only ever going to increase. Populations are getting older. We know that. People are starting to get, they're taking on more of a degree of education, which means that they're working later, which means that they can't support their relatives as directly as soon. People aren't going to be retiring largely when they're 50. That's not a standard thing that you think about anymore. The more cynical person in me worries about how private equity, particularly in healthcare, is one of those need-based areas in regards to nursing homes that have a population that is both growing but also increasingly less able to actualize their own systemic change. You've got a group of people who are, it's 70% of nursing home residents are women, most of whom are likely to have a spouse that is not alive. Over 50% have some form of cognitive impairment. There are mobility and self-care limitations. And so the reality is that you have a group of people with a steady supply of funds who are less able to push back against the tension between profit maximization and patient care.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing your speculation. I think it was helpful. I think that we talked about earlier in the episode some of the legal loopholes that exist in this space. But could you maybe speak to the broader relationship between regulatory agencies and private equity groups? Specifically, maybe we can just start with who's in charge of that regulation. What does that look like?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. There's really two layers of regulation, as I'm sure most of us, certainly most of us in law school are aware of. There's federal and state regulation. Most regulation for nursing home care, because these are going to be regulations governing nursing home care, are at the state level. That's where you've got dense codes with the nitty-gritty discussion of how much you're allowed to profit. They seem to be broadly, from what I've seen, like fairly aligned with a bit of variation, but fairly aligned. And then you have federal regulations as well, through either executive order, Health and Human Services. Broadly, it comes up under that remit. And that has been taking a back seat in terms of hands-on regulation. As I was writing this paper, the Biden administration came out with that executive order, and I remember like the day before the order was announced, I was writing, the federal regulation has not, made any leaps since the 1980s, and then this happened, and I was like, oh wow, okay, it was a massive shock. Not so much of a shock because it was announced at the State of the Union, but you can never be 100% sure that something announced at the State of the Union is going to manifest. But largely speaking, state regulatory health agencies, very similar, I'm sure, only to the ones that you had worked with when you were working in Georgia.
Yeah, yes. A lot of that regulation is done at a state level in Georgia as well. A lot of the pushback, similarly, is lobbying at a state level. Big healthcare systems, nursing home systems have a lot of power in that space to work with local state governments.
So, what are some of the reasons why this hasn't been addressed yet in legislation, or why it has taken a backseat?
That's a tough question because I don't mean to, what is the phrase in law school? I don't mean to fight the hypo, but I do see it as having been addressed. I don't think it's been addressed effectively. I mean, I think that there have been attempts. I think what happened during the pandemic is a really good example. During the pandemic, you know, we saw a lot of studies come out talking about the state of nursing home residents, and from that, members of Congress at the national level were introducing bills, for example. One bill, the COVID-19 Nursing Home Protection Act, proposed $750 million in federal funding that could go directly into nursing homes. And another one proposed, it's called the Quality Care for Nursing Home Residents and Workers During COVID-19 and Beyond Act. So really easy, it rolls off the tongue. And it proposed heightened minimum standards for nursing, which has now come to fruition through the executive order. Neither bill passed, but especially looking at that first bill, it's not uncommon for, in times of crisis and when a story like this is broken, for politicians, well-meaning legislators, to say, hey, we should give them more money. These places are decrepit. They don't have staff. They don't have food. They don't have equipment. We should give them money. And I think that that's an incredibly well-intentioned proposal. My issue with that is that through these loopholes, when you've got, I think at last check, 11% of nursing homes in the U.S. were owned by private equity companies. The last statistic that I have, 70% are over 70% are privately owned, but 11% total owned by private equity. And if you've got these types of models where people can take that money and reinvest it into their fund to generate profit for their investors, pre-profit of the nursing home, when you look at the balance sheet, that money, it's not an issue of having money. These funds have money. It's more so an issue of incentivizing them to spend it on something other than themselves. And by incentivizing, I mean regulating, which is it's a harsh word. So yeah, I think you've got a lot of well-intentioned, you know, let's give more Medicaid funding. Like, I would never say the government should invest less in healthcare. Having said that, it's tricky to know, and only since these studies have started to come out and people have started to talk about it more, and you have more political will from attorney generals like the New York AG to prosecute and to sue this type of harm, have we been understanding that the transparency issue is a big part of why we don't know where the money is going, and we don't really know who owns these nursing homes. So we don't know how they're spending it or how they're incentivized to spend it. So I absolutely think there have been things in the works to help mitigate the harm. I just don't know how effective it's been in light of how opaque this area is.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of, at least what I saw at the state level, was the creation of a real interest in data and transparency. Mm-hmm. Whether or not data-driven policy is a buzzword or actually sort of comes to fruition, I think is up for debate sometimes. But I do think that is an area that has ripened, I would say, maybe over the past decade or so.
I totally agree. And the sort of, on the other hand to that, though, that really nags at me is that, you know, we're seeing a situation where people are now going to have access, if this executive order manifests over the next 5 years, to more transparent information on the ownership structure of the nursing home that they might be looking at. But are we then basically telling, I mean, depending on where it's posted, depending on how easy this information is to access, the burden is now shifting onto families with elderly, the vast majority elderly people going into these nursing homes, dealing with a lot of, no doubt, stress, a lot of turbulence, and the burden is now on them to do their research, to find out, okay, is it one of these profit maximizing owners, or is it a public owner, or is it something in between? And are we going to help them now that we've, like, quote unquote turned them into, I don't know, some ideal of a discerning consumer, now that they have the tools, so to speak? And I worry that it will, transparency is no doubt important, but I worry that it will stop there. And I would hope that that's not the case, because the burden is then almost entirely on the people who are both victims and the most in need.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think the narrative of opaqueness in private equity, as I can understand, follows, institutions and spaces beyond healthcare as well, into businesses and business models. And I guess I'm curious about your opinion on private equity investments as maybe a positive for some people and what they believe. So I guess a critique of this argument might be listeners who feel private equity investments might help support businesses that would otherwise fail, and help these businesses develop efficient, innovative business models. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I know I would love to discuss this. I think a couple of thoughts are coming to mind. In terms of how this might develop, like, an interesting business model. To respond to that, if your goal is to create an interesting, effective business model, in theory, in the abstract, then on paper, yes, they've proven their point. You take this private equity model with the existing regulations in this nursing home industry, and you can generate huge profits using this business model. So as an academic exercise, it's been proven. I would push back on the premise that they're supporting businesses that might otherwise fail. I think these are, first of all, in terms of, say, like the catering or the cleaning or these other businesses that are taking the fees. These are businesses surely by the making of the fund, by design of the fund, as a mechanism for the fund to take money. And so these businesses are, in my head, I think of them as almost pop up and have a purpose, and that is to siphon and provide minimal support. But also, private equity owned nursing homes are, my understanding is, slightly on the decline, because again, all of this is being brought to light. But at last count, 11% of all nursing homes. So, it's not as if the majority of the lion's share of this landscape is owned by private equity, and no doubt the country would survive if, in the short term, that smaller percent wound down. But as you pointed out, I mean, there are critiques that these private owners will face that they're doing harm. Am I correct in understanding that is kind of the main criticism that you would say they might push back against, that they're doing harm?
Yes, I would agree.
So, I mean, they might, I would see them as having a few responses to those allegations. First, they would say that their duty of care is to their investors. They're a company, not a charity. And their duty of care is to the people who invest in them. And I believe that that's the first thing they would say. And second, they would probably say that it benefits their investors and their clients or patients, whatever you want to call them, so to speak, to have a robust business with a lot of money so that they can reinvest in them, so that they can open up more venues, so that they can help people by opening up more nursing homes. But the bottom line is that you can't have two primary motivations. You can't be primarily motivated to maximize profit for yourself and your investors, and primarily motivated to help patients. And if at any point, and I say if when I really mean when at every point, the profit maximizing motivation is at odds with the patient care, help, motivation. I don't see a world in which of their own volition they are going to choose patient care over maximizing profit. Because of what's been discussed, and because it's allowed. So, to their response to my hypothetical critique and my rejoinder of that hypothetical response, I think increased regulation needs to happen to sort of navigate these, what I see as competing tensions at the core.
Definitely. I think it would be interesting to discuss with you if you are up for it, the Stewart Health sort of scandal in Boston. Do you know about that?
I'm probably less familiar with it than you are. Do you mind giving a quick...
Yeah, a synopsis. So from my understanding, we'll start generally. The Northeast has been very anti-private healthcare, historically. And then specifically very anti, I think, large private healthcare. And there was a Catholic chain of hospitals in Boston that was in trouble. And I believe it was the state government. They allowed Stewart Health to come in and buy those hospitals. And there was some private equity shenanigans. The private equity group there, I do believe they executed a sale back, a lease back agreement, yes, which is something that happens in Georgia as well.
Good to know what's happening everywhere.
Tangent aside, they came in. Long story short, private equity leaves, hospitals failing. I think the sort of debate is whether or not to bail out that hospital system under sort of the competing narratives that A, it will encourage bad behavior, or B, they have extensive service provision lines, and even though, as we know, private equity closes a lot of service provision lines, they are providing care to a lot of people. So it's an interesting sort of dilemma.
That is a toughie. And I think when we're in like this podcast is about law students and legal issues, and I think one of the things about law school that I find particularly interesting and also frustrating is that we're always thinking about, okay, if we do something, what is it going to encourage or discourage? And while I think that's extremely important in this case, because you might be encouraging, what we consider to be in hindsight bad behavior, blurring those lines between public and private, where you have a mandate to maintain public. We really, not knowing as much about the needs and the issues as you do, the way that I would start by thinking about it is, what are the needs of, if this is primarily happening in Boston, the harm is happening in Boston, what are the needs of Bostonians? Are they being met by the existing infrastructure? And if not, is this a vital locus for meeting their needs? And if so, how can we, A, buttress regulations such that this type of loophole, this type of sale leaseback that can happen under the table, because you can have a firm come in and swoop in. You have this concept in international law when a hedge fund, it's affectionately called a vulture fund, when they'll take a country at its weakest and they'll swoop in with massive interest rates, and it's a rock and a hard place. Countries take it, Argentina quite famously. But in this context, how do we create an incentive such that is not a decision that a public hospital has to make? And in the short term, how do we ensure that they are armed against making that decision again now if we do bail them out? I sincerely hope that an infrastructure that supports, no doubt, well-meaning nurses and physicians is able to remain afloat. But I completely agree that we need to be mindful of not doing so in a way that just injects money, no holds barred, and creates a status quo where this type of behavior is acceptable, especially in a sanctuary almost. Like I would say, like the state of Massachusetts for healthcare that people traditionally know that they can trust the provenance of.
Yeah, definitely. Charlotte, I'd love if we could touch on some of the things that everyday people could do about this, get involved with, if people are listening to this and they really just have a passion to get things done. What would you recommend?
Well, first, please reach out to me if you have a passion to get things done and you're listening to this podcast episode. But a couple of really basic things. I would start out by, I know I just railed against the burden being on the patient to inform themselves, but I would make an effort to inform yourself. Try and become a little bit more familiar with some of the information right now out about private equity ownership. You can use my article as a starting point, and kind of inform yourself about just broadly speaking what your local government is doing, your state government, in addition to keeping an ear to the ground for what the federal government is doing. And I plan on continuing to work and publishing on this, so I will do my best to make that available. I think in terms of what you can do to help get involved, it's a cliche, but your vote is your voice. And I know that's a particularly strong statement to make right now, shortly after a national election. And I don't want to imply that care home residents, I don't want to infantilize them and say, oh, they're not capable of moving the dial on their own, because that's not the case at all. They're very much their own advocates. But I think that they're advocates in a different way. I think that they're advocating for themselves by fighting every day. By choosing to try and make the most of disastrous, oftentimes, living conditions. They're their own advocates by courageously speaking to people who will take their very sensitive stories and use them, hopefully, to raise the narrative profile of what's happening to them. But when you're in a situation where you can't get someone to close your window, you're worried about getting hypothermia, or you can't get someone to change your bedpan so you don't get an ulcer, it's very difficult for that group of people to get someone to take them to a polling station or to help them fill out an online ballot when they can't get those most basic material needs. The best that we can do is look for interventions and make this a sticking point with our vote, telling our representatives, this is important to me. I strongly believe that will make the strongest difference.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that call to action. I am surely excited. That is all we have time for today. Charlotte, thank you so much for joining us on Flaw School. We are happy to talk private equity and healthcare with you any day.
Thank you. I've had such a pleasure speaking with you both, and I look forward to chatting more off camera, off recorder, whatever it's called, later on.
Yeah, I also just want to say thank you for such a wonderful conversation. I found it lovely to pick your brain this evening.
And thank you, Molly, for being a great co-host. It's been wonderful to chat with you.
Of course, right back at you, Gory. If you're interested in reading Charlotte Lawrence's full article or learning more about the flaws in our legal system, check out the Flaw magazine at theflaw.org. And Charlotte, would you like to tell listeners where they can find you?
On any given day, no. You can find me. You can use my email address, my school email address. It's claurence@jd25.law.harvard.edu, and I will try and make sure that it's uploaded next to my article so that anyone who wants to chat this subject can reach out. I'd love it.
Thank you. And if you enjoyed this episode, please first make sure to check out the show notes. There will be some awesome links and references there. And make sure to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also check out flawschool.org for more content. Thank you all so much for listening, and we're looking forward to talking at you in the future. Class is dismissed.